Good morning.
Good morning.
Our reading was taken from the book of Deuteronomy. We are going to go back to that reading. I'm sure all of us are still in that book. So we are going to go back to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5, and we will take the reading again. Then we will move on from there. It was read from Deuteronomy chapter 5, and the first 5 verses were read to us by Brian. I will quickly take the reading again. And Moses summoned all Israel, and he said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb, not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, while I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up into the mountain Hillside." I think we have run out of electricity. The power has been taken away. Please can we try? Keep pressing. Okay. Before we can make any comments about the reading that we were reading, in all the communities where people live, it is not uncommon to find people grouping themselves into some groups that are either called groups, or some are called associations, or some are called societies. We know what are called burial societies or building societies in our communities, associations, whatever league that may be formed. Even nations do exactly the same. In our only situation in the Southern Africa, we know that all our countries have been grouped into a certain association that is called SADC. You have names like COMESA, you have names like Arab League, the European Union, etc. It is a grouping of nations that come together. We know even in sport that we have associations like in soccer, for example, you have a big association which is going to cover all the countries, which is called FIFA, but each individual country is also allowed to come up with their own administration. Like in the case of our Zimbabwe, we have what is called ZIFA, etc. Africa itself has what is called CAF. It's not uncommon to find these associations being formed wherever people are involved. But what is of big importance in these associations is the crafting of what is called the Constitution. Because the Constitution is then going to bind all the member states or all the member associations, or even if it was a burial society where people go in and join voluntarily, there should be some constitution which is going to regulate how that association is going to be operating. So it's the onus is now upon every individual who would have joined to make sure that they know this constitution, so that they are not going to be found foul of the constitution at whatever point in their lives, as long as they remain as members in these associations. If we come to the situation of God, we have always found that God has required people to be in a certain association. If you go back to the Old Testament, for example, you are going to discover that God groped the children of Israel. Apparently, we were looking at them just this morning, that these were the people of God in the Old Testament. So God then gave them what I would call this morning, for the purpose of this study, a constitution. You may actually call it a testament, or you may call it a covenant, or you may call it an agreement, whatever name you use. It's some constitution which God wanted these people to observe. So that when you observe such a constitution, you are always going to be found being obedient to what God would have said. I remember in the book of Numbers chapter 15, the constitution, or part of the constitution of the children of Israel, was saying that they were supposed to keep the Sabbath holy. But we are going to find in Numbers chapter 15, as we read, I think from about verse 32, we are going to read about a man who was found in the wilderness, and he was picking up sticks, probably for firewood, on the day of the Sabbath. He had gone against what the Constitution said, and this man, he had to be taken out of the camp, and he was stoned by the whole camp until he died. He died because he was regarded, or he was deemed to have gone against the Constitution, so he deserved to die. So they killed him because he had not followed the Constitution. So it is always important. We have seen people being chucked out of the associations they are members to, because they would have failed to abide by the Constitution, because the Constitution is a guideline which tells you what to do and what not to do. So the Bible is exactly the same thing. But what is important is not to have the Constitution before us. What is important is then to know the do's and the don'ts in that Constitution, because we are only going to be obedient to it or disobedient to it, either if we know what it says or if we don't know what it says. I don't know this man who would be killed in Numbers chapter 15, whether he knew that there was a law which said he was supposed to keep the Sabbath holy, or he just chose. If he knew, then he just chose to be disobedient. And there is always a penalty that goes along with those that would have been disobedient to a certain constitution. So I have noticed that in the religious people today, the confusion that we actually have, the disharmony that we have, the disagreement that we have in the religious people. Right now we are here, we are actually listening to some music that is coming from next door. It's actually coming from some people who are religious people, who have come on a day which is called the Lord's Day, which is a Sunday, to worship God. We have always stood by the fact that the Bible teaches that we cannot use instruments in worshiping God, because God never required us to use them. But we are seeing people next door, or we are actually at least hearing what they are belting out. They are belting out tune after tune, to the extent of almost overshadowing what we are doing here. Why? There is this disharmony because there is a problem in understanding the Constitution of God. There is a problem in understanding the covenant or the testament of God. So this morning I just want to run through a few things that I would want us to take home about the Old Testament, which is usually called the Law of Moses, and the New Testament, which is commonly referred to as the Gospel of Christ. I just want to look at some things that I'm going to put up on the board, and I'm going to try to explain some of them so that we can understand whether this thing is one. Is the Old Testament the New Testament? Is the New Testament the Old Testament? Are the two one? Are they common? Do they require people to do exactly the same? We are going to find out some of those things as we actually move into it. So I've actually called the title of this presentation, The Law of Moses versus the Gospel of Christ. So the Old Testament, basically 39 books of the Old Testament, we know that they are usually called the Law of Moses. Of course, we know that Moses is only going to appear beginning in the book of Exodus. But he is the one, as you will also notice in the bulletin that I've just dished out, that Moses is the one who actually wrote the book of Genesis. We know that he did write the book of Genesis. So essentially, the whole Old Testament, 39 of those books are actually called the Law of Moses. They are commonly referred to as the Law of Moses. But we know that this law did not come to Moses, or did not come from Moses. It rather came to Moses from God. So it was not his law, it was the law of God, which is referred to commonly as the Law of Moses. The New Testament, which comprises of the 27 books that we find on the other side of the Old Testament, that law is usually called the New Testament, but we also commonly refer to it as the Gospel of Christ. So we are going to go into it and see, we are going to be juxtaposing the two side by side, and we are going to be taking notes on some of these things, or some of these two laws, to find out whether they were the same. And the first thing that I want to say about the law of Moses is that it was specifically for the Jewish nation. This morning in our Bible study, we were talking about these people, and in fact we were talking about their origin, that they originated from their ancestor who was called Abraham. And Abraham is the father of the Jewish nation, so to speak, even though he did not live as a Jew himself, but he actually is going to have his descendants who are going to become Jews. He was referred to as a Hebrew, as we noticed in Genesis chapter 14 this morning, and his children are also going to be referred to as Hebrews, simply because their forefather Abraham was called a Hebrew. They were also called the Israel, the nation of Israel, or they were called the Israelites. This is exactly what we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 5. If you are still there with me, I want you to take notice of what Moses says as he is writing verse 1 of Deuteronomy chapter 5. And Moses summoned all Israel, and he said to them, I want us to respect that wording. He summoned all Israel. Or in other words, he summoned all the Hebrews. Or in other words, he summoned all those people that came out of the 12 tribes that were born by Jacob. He did not summon the whole world. We should remember that by this time when Moses is writing this story, they are actually camped at the Moabite plains after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Moses is about to die, so he's going to write this second law, which is called the law of Deuteronomy, which is now known as Deuteronomy. He is writing this book. They have been out of Egypt for over 40 years now. They have fought a couple of wars along the way. So this law that Moses is writing while they are waiting to cross the Jordan and go into Canaan is being written, or is being told to the children of Israel. It's not being told, or rather Moses is not saying, after I have told you this law, take it back and also tell it to the Egyptians, or take it back and tell it to everybody else. It's specifically for the children of Israel, as I have just written there, that the law of Moses was specifically for the Jewish nation. This is at least what Moses is telling us here. If you go with me to the other passage that I have quoted there, which is chapter 7, and if you read with me the two verses, verse 6 and verse 8, there is something that we are going to discover from there. Verse 6 says, for you are a people, who are a people that Moses is talking about, the children of Israel, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you who? The children of Israel. He has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So at least what Moses is telling us here is that there were other people who were living elsewhere who were not chosen. Only this small group was chosen. But listen to what he says in the verses that are coming from verse 7. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all the people. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They were not chosen because they were more. They were not chosen because they were several. Actually, their writer or their leader at the time was saying to them, you were chosen because God loved you. Who is being chosen? The Israelites. So the law is being directed to the Israelites. It was not being directed to the people of God in general of today. It was being directed to the Israelites. So this law specifically was for the Jewish nation. But on the other hand, we then see and discover that the gospel of Christ was to be preached to all creation. So in other words, we can call it a universal law. This now is a universal law which is being given to everybody else. It's not segregating, it's not segregational, it is being given to everybody else. In Mark chapter 16, Jesus said to his disciples on that day, as he is commissioning them and he's sending them out, he said to them, go into all the world. Mark chapter 16, verse 15, and preach the gospel to every creature. By every creature, of course, we would understand that he was honestly talking about those that would understand the gospel. I don't think Jesus was saying to every creature, referring to the ants, referring to elephants, referring to cows, because you may preach the whole year to a cow, it's not going to listen to you. What Jesus was saying, he was talking to the disciples, and he is saying, go into all the world. When God talked to Moses on this day, he did not say in Deuteronomy chapter 5, go and tell the world. Rather, he said, summon all the Israelites and tell them. But the gospel of Christ now is being told to everybody, not only to the children of Israel. But this one is a universal law. That's the first difference. That's the first thing that we need to understand about the law of Moses, commonly referred to as the law of Moses, and of course the gospel of Christ. And the second thing, the next thing that I want us to see about the law of Moses is that the followers needed a yearly atonement for sins with animal sacrifice being at the center of the atonement. You may remember that in Leviticus chapter 16, Moses wrote this book while he is camped at Mount Sinai together with the children of Israel. He is writing this law of Leviticus, of course the book being drawn from the Levitical priesthood. So it's named after the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood being the children of Israel again, not a universal law. So in chapter 16, he actually told them what they were supposed to do. And what was of particular importance was that every year they were supposed to gather at their tent or the tent of meeting or the tabernacle so that their sins were going to be atoned for. Their sins were not forgiven forever. They would be forgiven only once a year. So a priest would be needed to go into, he would need to atone for his sins first. He would kill a bull, take the blood inside. This is the only time that a priest was allowed to go inside the Holy of Holies, where he was going to atone for his own sins. He comes back, he was going to make available the two goats, and he was going to throw lots. One goat, which was going to be chosen, was going to be killed, and the other one was going to be taken into the wilderness to be destroyed, of course, by dangerous animals there. The one that is going away was then going to be called the sin bearer. It's taking the sins of the people away. And the one that was going to be killed, of course, that was going to be the sacrificial God, whose blood was going to be sprinkled on the people so that their sins were going to be forgiven. This was only a precept of the Jews, those that had come out of Abraham, who was called a Hebrew in Genesis chapter 14. But on the other hand, the gospel of Christ does not require us to go through the atonement for sins every year. In fact, the gospel itself, at least according to what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1, verse 16 to 17, it is itself the power of God for salvation to whoever believes. You remember, Paul actually says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to whoever believes. He goes on and says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And of course, he talked about it starting with the Jews and also everybody else, including the Greeks. They were going to be included in the gospel of Christ because it is the power of God itself. It does not need any atonement for sins because the gospel itself is the power of God for salvation. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed, so that all of us are going to live by faith in the gospel of Christ. That's a big difference that we actually see between the law of Moses and also the gospel of Christ. The other thing that we can also see there is that if you spend the whole time teaching somebody the Old Testament, the end product you are going to have is going to be a Jew. If you teach seriously to somebody and they follow toe to toe what the New Testament says, they are never going to live like a Jew. The New Testament will convert somebody into a Christian, while the Old Testament is going to completely convert somebody into a Jew. If you teach somebody the Old Testament, there is nothing which is associated with Christianity they can practice after having read the Old Testament. And the same is true with the New Testament. If you teach somebody the New Testament without him having the knowledge of the Old Testament, there is nothing they can practice which is going to be synonymous with what they were practicing in the Old Testament. For example, if you are going to teach somebody the Old Testament, what they are going to know is to keep the Sabbath holy. Because the Old Testament demands that those who were keeping it were supposed to keep the Sabbath holy. The other thing they would also know is exactly what we were just talking about the earlier point, where we were talking about the sins, the atonement of sins which was happening here. You can only get that in the Old Testament. If you were on another side, teach the same person the New Testament, and you require them to follow the New Testament, there is no way they are ever going to go back and keep the Sabbath holy. In fact, if we were going to teach them passages like 2 Corinthians chapter 3, they are actually going to come to you and say the Old Testament, the law of the Sabbath is gone. Because in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul tells us specifically that the Sabbath was going to go. Together with everything that was associated with it, it was actually going to go. You remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul is going to talk about Moses, whose face was, they could not look at his face because it was shining on the day that he brought the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. Yet Paul actually says that was temporary, it was going to go. Why was it going? Because somebody which had more glory than that had come. He is talking about the gospel of Christ, which is the New Testament. If you teach somebody that, they are not going to observe the so-called 10 Commandments, including the keeping of the Sabbath holy. So, the law of Moses, anybody who is going to train himself into it is going to become like a Jew, and they are going to live like a Jew. But those that are going to train themselves with the gospel of Christ, they are going to live like a Christian. They have no connection at all with how people were living in the Old Testament. The other thing that I want us to notice there is, in the law of Moses, one was born already in the covenant relationship with God. At least this is what we read when God was talking through the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 31, reading from verse 31 to 34. He was making a promise, a solemn promise to these people, that this law which you have been keeping, this law that your fathers kept, this very law is actually going to pass. I am going to change it, and you are going to have a new law. And of course, that is going to be confirmed as well in Hebrews chapter 8, when we are being told that that which had gotten old is now past. We no longer have it in our vicinity at all. So the law of Moses, one was born already in the covenant relationship with God. You did not apply to become a Jew. The moment you are born a Jew, you were forced to be a Jew. You were forced to follow all the laws of the Jews. This is why this man in Numbers chapter 15 is going to be killed. Why was he killed? You are a Jew, but you are working on a Sabbath. Why? Because this law, as long as you were born a Jew, you had to follow it. Whether you liked it or not, you are actually deemed already to be in a covenant relationship with God. That is unlike the gospel of Christ, because the gospel of Christ, one makes a deliberate or a voluntary choice to be in the covenant relationship with God. Nobody is forced. If you remember, on the day of Pentecost, as recorded by Luke in the book of Acts chapter 2, Peter has been preaching all this time, and he has been preaching to the people that he had gathered to celebrate Pentecost in the city of Jerusalem on the day. So when Peter has told them about them killing Christ, and he has given them all this crime and this sin, and he has told them that it was a sin, and when he concluded by telling them that this very Christ that you have killed, this very Jesus, he actually has been made both Lord and Christ. We are told in Acts chapter 2, verse 36, that people were cut to their heart. And they asked Peter and they said to him, "What then shall we do?" Peter is going to reply, and he said to them in verse 37, "Repent and be baptized, every one of you, for the forgiveness of your sins." And we are of course told that about 3,000 people are going to be baptized on that day, from verse 37, 38, coming down. We are actually going to see Peter's reply and the response of the people. Why is Peter saying to them, "Repent and be baptized"? Because it's a deliberate choice. You are not forced to become a Christian. Unlike what was happening with the Mosaic law, the gospel of Christ you choose. We were not created like a robot where you are going to be, where you are going to be like an automatic robot where you have to react to everything. You react to that which you want. God gives everybody a choice to become his or her, to become his child or to become her child. That is what we see in Acts chapter 2. In fact, if you are going to read through the book of Acts until you get to chapter 5, when Ananias and Sapphira are going to die, we would actually call those the formative years of the church. You will actually see that everybody that was ever baptized to become a Christian, there is not a single person that was forced. If you were forced to become a Christian, you would have been forced by the word itself, that it would have convinced you, not because you were born a Christian. Nobody is going to be killed for not wanting to become a Christian, unlike what was happening with the Mosaic law. Of course, everybody who refuses to become a Christian, that's exactly what we did not read. We did not get as far as that. In Mark chapter 16, Jesus actually said, "Go into all the world and preach to every creature. He that is going to believe and is baptized is going to be saved. But he that is going to deny baptism, he is going to be condemned." Only Christ is going to condemn the one who would have refused to be part of the gospel, his gospel, not today, but when he comes back, which is always commonly referred to as the second coming of Christ. So one makes a deliberate or a voluntary choice to be in the covenant relationship with God, unlike in the Old Testament times when one was born already in the covenant relationship with God. You could not opt out, but you can opt out in the gospel of Christ. If you choose not to become a Christian, you are free to do that. You can still walk scot-free and nobody is going to arrest you or stone you to death for having that choice. Only God is actually going to sort you out at the later stage when he comes back. Under the Mosaic law, they did not need anyone to die. What I'm saying is they did not need an individual human being to die. What they actually needed was an animal blood. So the animal blood was necessary for their sins to be forgiven or for their sins to be atoned for. So they did not need anyone to die. They actually needed animal blood. In fact, that's exactly what we will see again in Leviticus chapter 16, that an innocent goat would lose his life for a guilty person. So your sins, in fact, I think the idea that God had was so that you would see that this goat, which is actually dying to cleanse you, is actually innocent when you are supposed to be more innocent than the goat. The goat is actually more innocent than you. And this blood was going to be used to atone for your sins. So they did not need anybody to die. They needed goats to die once a year so that their sins could be atoned for. But of course, in the gospel of Christ, came into being after Jesus' death. It did not just come, but it came because Jesus actually died, and his blood, which we were observing this morning by drinking from those small cups, the grape juice, which resembles his blood. we needed this blood so that this covenant can be unlocked. In Hebrews chapter 9, we are actually going to read that passage 11 to 14, Hebrews chapter 9. Christ's blood was actually needed. In fact, this is what the passage says. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, which was not made with hands, that is not of this creation. What is the writer saying here? If we go back to the book of Leviticus chapter 16, where we have just been, we are going to discover that the tabernacle had two rooms. One which was bigger, and the inner room, which was called the Hall of Holies, was a bit smaller. This is where the Ark of the Covenant was. And this is where basically God was. So the children of Israel knew that God was inside and he was in the Ark. This is where the Ten Commandments of God also resided, in the Ark of the Covenant. Every other day during the year, the high priest would come, and he would only come as far as the first room, which was called the holy place. He would not go into the most holy place. If he went in there, he would die. He would only be allowed to go in there this day once, on the Day of Atonement. So this is the tent that this writer is actually writing about. Now, what he is saying is, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things, meaning to say, whoever had appeared before, including Aaron, who became the priesthood, he appeared not for so good things. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, the tent that he is referring to is the tabernacle which the Israelite priest used. But he is now talking about the more perfect tent, which was not made with hands. We know the tabernacle was made with hands, of course. Moses was leading that process. But the one that Jesus came for, it was not made with hands. It is not of this creation. In fact, in verse 12 he says, he entered once for all into the holy places. The holy place is not the physical one. You may actually remember that in Hebrews chapter 8, the writer actually he was retelling the story before, and he actually said when Moses was about to build the tabernacle, he was told by God to take the pattern that he had been given by God, which was a heavenly pattern. So the tabernacle that Moses built on earth, actually it was a shadow of the heavenly temple, or the heavenly tabernacle which was residing with God, which was not made with hands, but that was actually created by God himself. So this is the tabernacle that Christ went into. He did not go into the tabernacle, physical tabernacle, earthly tabernacle that Moses made. He actually entered once for all into the holy places which is in heaven, not by means of the blood of goats and cows, but by means of his own blood, by so doing securing an eternal redemption. Verse 13 says, for if the sprinkling of defiled persons with the blood of goats, which was evidently happening in Leviticus chapter 16 on the Day of Atonement, if the sprinkling of defiled persons with the blood of goats and bulls and with the ashes of a heifer sanctifies for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? When Christ came, he came and he took the position of the two gods. The Day of Atonement has been taken away because Christ came once and for all. When he died, he actually became like that God which was the sin bearer. He also became like that God which was the sacrificial lamb. Christ became that he replaced those two, and he actually went to heaven, to the tabernacle which is heaven, not to the earthly tabernacle, by so doing securing an eternal redemption for those that are going to follow. This setup was not there in the Old Testament. This setup is not there under the law of Moses. This setup is only found in the gospel of Christ. In the law of Moses, they needed a human priest who is going to kill or slaughter a goat so that their sins could be forgiven. And that had to be repeated year after year. you will remember when Jesus is dying on the cross. In fact, by the time that Jesus is going to die, the tabernacle is no more, but what was existing now was the temple that had been built by Solomon. So this tabernacle, of course, the one that had been built by Solomon had been destroyed by Babylon, and they built another one, which was built by Zerubbabel, but that one also had been in poor form. So Herod the Great had built them a very new temple, very good looking temple. When Jesus is born, he actually was born when this temple is existing. The temple was built alongside the same specifications of the tabernacle. It still had the holy place and the most holy place, which would only be gone into by the priest once a year. When Jesus is dying on the cross, you will remember that the curtain, which was dividing these two rooms, the Bible tells us that it was torn from top to bottom. Why? Because Jesus is now exposing whatever was hidden there, which would only be seen by a priest. Jesus is exposing everything because Jesus is the most high priest who is now going to take everything and is going to be administered from heaven. It's no longer being administered on earth. Mosaic law demanded them to administer everything in a physical temple. The gospel of Christ requires everything to be administered from him who is the head. At least that's what we are told by the book of Colossians and the book of Ephesians as well. It tells us that he is the head. So that's what we actually discover here. And also the other thing that we may notice there, with the law of Moses, it actually ended at the cross. In fact, that's exactly what we read in Colossians chapter 2, reading from verse 14 and 17. In fact, we are actually told that its ordinances were a shadow of what was actually coming. At least that's what verse 16 to 17 tells us in Colossians chapter 2. Everything was nailed to the cross. When Christ is also dying on the cross, the law of Moses is also being killed. It's actually ending on that particular day because a new law, which is called the gospel, is going to become and is going to be in full force until his return. That's what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that when Christ comes, he actually is going to hand over the kingdom to his Father. This is after the completion of his mission. When he comes, the kingdom is going to be taken. He would have put everything under his feet. The only thing that is going to be put underfoot or for the final time is going to be death. And that's going to be happening when Christ comes back. That's exactly the story or the picture we get in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, reading from verse 23, 26, as opposed to the law of Moses, which actually ended at the cross when Christ died. The gospel of Christ is going to be in force until his return. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 23. So what is the conclusion of all that I've been saying this morning? The conclusion is this. If all people dotted around the world and the entire globe, wherever they are, if they were going to understand these basic tenets of these two Old Testaments, we wouldn't be having the disharmony that I've alluded to when I began, which we are having amongst the religious people. We wouldn't be having all this disagreement. In fact, we would actually be doing exactly the same thing here, next door, and wherever. Because if we were reading and understanding the gospel from Christ in the same manner, we would surely be doing exactly the same thing. That has not happened, and that probably is never going to happen. But what we would want to do ourselves, as those people that have always said we are in the Lord's church, we actually need to understand this information. And when we have understood it, probably do exactly what Paul taught Timothy. That what I am telling you, tell it to other people who are faithful, who also are going to take it and tell others who are faithful, who also are, the chain is going to go on and on and on like that. Once we have known this information, we also need to take this information to others, so that at least we never know whom you may influence, so that everybody is going to know that there is a big difference between the law of Moses and the gospel of Christ. A person who is living today, who would want to go into eternal life one day, does not live under the law of Moses. If he follows the law of Moses, he is going to be lost. In fact, the book of James talks about something like that. I think James actually says, if you are going to break one of those laws, he was talking about some of those people who would want to follow this law and they don't follow that law. For example, if you think about the Sabbath law, we have people who are so fussy about this Sabbath law today. They try to follow the Sabbath law, and they say they are keeping it holy. But they are not keeping it holy because the Sabbath law had laws to it. They also needed to, the Mosaic people would actually keep the Sabbath holy every Saturday. But every 7 years, they would practice what was called the Sabbath year. Every 50 years, they would do what was called the Jubilee. Our own people today, in our own generation, doing exactly that. The year, which was the 7th year, they were not required to go into their fields to plant. You would not even go and take anything that would have remained from your previous harvest. Leave it for the poor. The children of Israel would actually do that. Those that are keeping the Sabbath holy today, are they doing exactly the same? They are not. If a person who was living under Moses, for example, then they didn't have cars. But let me just use that as an example. If he had a car that he was driving on a day and it got punctured, they would obviously not be allowed to repair the puncture because that was regarded as doing a job. Those that are alleging to be keeping the Sabbath holy today, if they are driving along the road and they have a puncture, what do? Are they going to leave the car there? Do they change the puncture? So, James then is right to say, if you are going to keep this law and you don't keep that, it's as good as you have disregarded all the law, because all the law came from one authority. That's what James at least said then. He was saying you cannot keep this law and choose to not to keep that one. The law of Christ, which is the gospel, Paul describes it in the book of Galatians as the law of liberty. The law that is not difficult to follow because it is the law of liberty, which is actually based on faith. I hope and trust that those few things might help us to build on them so that we can actually put the word out to make everybody understand that the law of Moses is gone. It was nailed on the cross, at least according to Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. What is enforced today is the gospel of Christ. Everybody who would want to go and live with Christ will have to abide by the gospel of Christ, not by the law of Moses. Because that one was for a specific race, as we actually read in Deuteronomy chapter 7. It was not a universal law, but the law of Christ, which is commonly referred to as the gospel. This one is the universal law. Thank you for listening. You have listened very well. I hope and trust this is going to help us all